In the blistering heat of the Arizona desert, 1882, a young Apache girl named Nayeli lay in the dirt, bleeding out from a brutal wound. Betrayed by her own tribe, abandoned to die. She could barely summon the strength to move as the vultures circled above, waiting for her last breath. Through blurry vision, she saw a shadow, Caleb Booker, a black rancher, whose hand hovered in hesitation. His heart raced with fear, but he couldn't leave her to die. Would saving this woman mean his own destruction? The burning question gnawed at him as he fought against everything he had been taught to believe. Before we continue, if you're watching this from anywhere in the world, leave your city name in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Caleb Booker rode alone through the harsh, unforgiving land of Arizona, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged mountains in the distance, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. His horse, Dusty, moved at a steady pace, the sound of its hooves crunching against the dry earth, the only sound in the otherwise silent desert. Caleb had learned long ago to appreciate the solitude of the open land. It was where he found peace, a kind of quiet that didn't judge him, a place where he could forget the pain of a past he couldn't outrun. He had been orphaned at the age of 10, when the desert swallowed his family whole. Since then, he'd lived and worked on Jedediah Stone's ranch, the rough edges of the world pressing in on him every day. But today, as he rode out on his usual patrol, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, the usual stillness broken by the eerie quiet that often came before trouble. His instincts told him something was wrong. Then he saw it. A small group of buzzards circled overhead, their flight patterns tight and purposeful. Caleb frowned, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. As he urged Dusty forward, the scent hit him first, the metallic, coppery smell of blood. His heart pounded in his chest as he crested a small rise and saw the bodies. 2 Apache warriors lay on the ground, their dark hair matted with blood, their bodies marked by arrows. Arrows not of a cowboy's making. These were Apache arrows, unmistakable in their craftsmanship. His gut twisted as he scanned the scene, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It didn't take long to realize what had happened. The fight had been brutal, and it wasn't one that involved any outsiders. These men had been killed by their own people. "Not my problem," Caleb muttered under his breath, his instincts telling him to turn around and ride back to the ranch. This was Apache business, the kind of thing Jedediah had warned him about. Stay away from it. The Apaches were a problem best left alone. But then he heard it. A groan. Caleb froze. His eyes scanned the area, but he couldn't see where the sound had come from. The silence was almost suffocating. He reached for his rifle, ready to defend himself if needed, but his feet moved on their own, taking him toward the sound. He found her in a narrow crevice beneath a rock overhang, almost completely hidden by shadows. She was slumped against the rock, barely conscious, her skin as pale as the dry earth around her. Blood soaked her buckskin tunic, and an arrow, the same kind as the ones that had killed the others, protruded from her sin. She was Apache, no doubt about it. A woman, young, maybe his age, though it was hard to tell through the dirt and the blood. She looked barely alive. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest as he stood over her, the rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Every instinct in him told him to walk away, to leave her there and ride back to safety. But then their eyes met. In that fleeting moment, something shifted. There was no hate, no defiance in her gaze, just raw, desperate fear, a plea for life. A war raged inside Caleb. He thought of his father's teachings, the lessons that had been drilled into him since he was a boy. The only good Apache is a dead Apache. He thought of Jedediah's hard, calloused face, of the way he'd speak of the Apaches like they were nothing more than animals. Don't get involved, Caleb. But Caleb couldn't move. He couldn't kill her. Not like this. Damn it, he whispered to himself, his fingers trembling on the rifle. The rifle he had always trusted. The rifle that had kept him alive in this cruel world. But this time, it didn't feel right. This time, it felt wrong. Caleb's hand eased off the rifle's stock. He dropped to his knees beside her, the weight of his decision crashing down on him. He didn't know why he was doing this. He didn't know why he was about to risk everything for someone who, moments ago, he would have considered his enemy. But as he touched her side, feeling the warmth of her blood seep through his fingers, something deep inside him stirred. He couldn't let her die. With a groan of exertion, Caleb carefully lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, but the weight of her life in his hands felt heavier than anything he had ever carried before. "You're not going to die today," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. Her or himself. He hoisted her onto his horse, his heart racing. The desert stretched out before him, endless and unforgiving. But for the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel alone. He didn't know it yet. But this moment, this act of mercy, would change everything. It would set him on a path where survival meant something more than just living. It meant choosing to stand against the world and choosing to fight for someone who had been taught to hate him. And so Caleb Booker rode into the unknown, carrying an Apache woman across the desert, unsure of what the future held, but knowing somehow that it would never be the same again. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the desert as Caleb Booker carefully guided his horse, Dusty, through the barren landscape. Nayeli's limp body rested against him, her head resting on his shoulder as he held her in place. The ride was slow, painfully slow, but Caleb didn't dare push her further. The arrow wound in her side was deep, and the blood loss had made her weak, her breathing shallow and uneven. Caleb's mind was a whirlwind of doubts. What had he gotten himself into? The Apache girl he'd saved was no ally. She was the enemy, wasn't she? Her people had raided settlements, stolen cattle, and fought against the settlers who were just trying to survive. But as he felt her warm breath against his neck, a part of him couldn't reconcile the image of a merciless raider with the fragile woman he now carried. He had no plan, no idea what he was doing, but he couldn't bring himself to turn back. Not now. As the day wore on, the heat became unbearable, and Caleb's mind began to drift. He knew his ranch back at the Circle S was the safest place to go, but that would mean bringing an Apache to the ranch, and Caleb knew full well what Jedediah Stone would do if he found out. He would kill them both, no questions asked. A dry wind kicked up, and Caleb squinted into the horizon, the landscape stretching out before him, endless and unforgiving. He had no idea where to go from here, just a vague hope that he could get her to a doctor. The nearest town, Dead Lantern, was still days away, and it was the last place Caleb wanted to go. His eyes flickered to Nayeli, and he caught himself wondering what her life had been like before the war had consumed everything. "Why didn't you kill me?" Her voice broke the silence, soft but clear enough to shake him from his thoughts. Caleb didn't look at her right away. He gritted his teeth, unsure how to answer. He had always been taught that compassion had no place in this world, that survival came before anything else. But in that moment, he realized he didn't have a clear answer. He shrugged, still not looking at her. "I couldn't." Nayeli's breath was labored, but she still managed to chuckle weakly. "You're an odd man, Caleb Booker." He didn't respond to the jibe. Instead, he focused on the trail, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in his gut. Every moment he spent in her presence was another step toward a future he couldn't control. Hours passed, the sun sinking lower into the sky as the night crept up. Caleb was starting to feel the weight of both the physical burden of carrying Nayeli and the mental strain of his choices. He had been trained to be a rancher, not a doctor, not a hero. He wasn't used to feeling responsible for anyone, especially not someone like her. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice softer now, like she didn't expect him to answer. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, his voice heavy. "Wherever I can get you help." "You're lying," she murmured, almost to herself. Caleb bristled at her words. "I'm not lying." But deep down he knew she was right. He didn't know what he was doing. He was running, not from the Apaches, but from the choices he had made, from the man he had been trained to be. The world he knew didn't allow for mercy, didn't allow for understanding between people who had been taught to hate each other for as long as anyone could remember. The thought weighed heavily on him. He looked down at Nayeli, her face pale under the sun's fading light. He wasn't sure if she would make it through the night. The wound in her side was serious, and he didn't have anything to stop the bleeding other than the torn-up shirt he had used to make a makeshift bandage. As the coldness of the evening air started to settle in, Caleb found a small patch of shade beneath a rocky outcrop and helped Nayeli down from the horse. He could feel his own exhaustion in every muscle, the weariness creeping up on him like a slow tide, pulling at his body and mind. But he didn't dare rest until he knew she was stable. He moved to build a small fire, his hands trembling as he fumbled for dry wood. The crackling flames illuminated the shadows on the ground, casting eerie shapes as Caleb turned his back for a moment. He wasn't used to caring for anyone but himself, and as he worked to make the camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was changing him, whether he wanted it or not. Nayeli's voice again broke the silence. "Why do you help me?" He turned to face her. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, were steady on him. Caleb sighed, kneeling beside the fire, and handed her a small cup of water. "Because," he said quietly, "I can't just leave you to die." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, Caleb saw not the Apache warrior, but a woman, just a woman, who had known only violence, survival, and fear. He saw the same pain in her eyes that he carried in his own heart, the same emptiness that had haunted him for years. In that fleeting moment, Caleb realized that he wasn't helping her out of duty or compassion alone. He was helping her because, somewhere deep inside, he needed to believe there was more to this world than the hate that had shaped both their lives. He needed to believe in something greater than the blood that had been shed, the lines that had been drawn. "I don't know what's going to happen," Caleb said, voice rough with emotion. "But I know I can't leave you." Nayeli didn't speak, but her eyes flickered with something between disbelief and gratitude. For the first time, Caleb thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake after all. The night passed slowly, with the crackling of the fire, the only sound keeping the dark at bay. Caleb barely slept, keeping an eye on Nayeli, whose breathing was still shallow. He tried to keep the fire going, though his exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His mind kept wandering back to the harsh truths of the world he'd been born into. He had been raised to hate the Apaches, to see them as enemies, as obstacles to the survival of men like him. But now, staring down at the woman who had been forced into this brutal life, Caleb felt the weight of those old lessons slip away. He watched as Nayeli stirred slightly, a soft groan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first, but slowly focusing on his face. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. She was still alive. He hadn't expected her to make it through the night. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Caleb nodded, unsure of what to say. The bond between them, still fragile, was beginning to take shape. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper, something more human than he had ever expected. He didn't look at her as an Apache girl anymore. He saw a person who was hurting, who had lost so much. He saw her as a survivor, just like him. "How do you feel?" Caleb asked quietly, his hands trembling as he offered her a drink of water. Nayeli drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I should be dead," she said simply, as if that truth were both a curse and a strange relief. "You were lucky," Caleb replied, his voice thick with the weight of his own guilt. He knew luck had nothing to do with it. He had saved her. He had chosen to save her. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the fire casting shadows over their faces. Caleb's mind kept racing, the memory of his mother's teachings, of the way he had been raised to fear and loathe the Apache people, now a distant echo in his mind. It didn't matter anymore. Not here, not now. All that mattered was what came next. After a while, Nayeli spoke again, her voice softer. You're not like the others, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to understand him better. Caleb felt a jolt in his chest. He wasn't sure what she meant by the others, but he didn't need to ask. The world around them, the world he had grown up in, was full of men who followed orders without question, who followed hate without understanding. Caleb had always felt like an outsider in that world, even when he had belonged. I'm just trying to do what's right, Caleb replied, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something in Nayeli's eyes, a mix of disbelief and gratitude. She wasn't sure if she could trust him yet, but she was beginning to understand that he wasn't the man she had been taught to fear, the same way he had been taught to fear her. I'm not a soldier, Caleb added after a pause. I'm not a warrior. I don't know what I'm doing, but I won't leave you. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her mind clearly working through the complex mix of emotions that Caleb could only guess at. The sound of the wind picking up, the distant call of a bird in the night, seemed to fill the void between them. Why? She asked, looking up at him, her expression guarded. Why do you help me? You've been taught to kill my people, haven't you? Why save me? Caleb had no easy answer. He had no explanation for why he couldn't leave her behind. No simple answer for why he had defied everything he had been taught. I don't know, Caleb said, his voice low. But I do know that what you're fighting for isn't any different from what I'm fighting for. We both just want to survive. We both want peace. Nayeli's lips parted slightly as she took in his words. She had heard such things from men before, promises of peace and honor, but they had always been hollow, twisted by the bitterness of a world too entrenched in its own hatred to ever change. But there was something in Caleb's voice that made her hesitate. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't offering empty words. Peace, she repeated softly, the word lingering in the air between them. They shared a quiet moment, the weight of their histories hanging over them, but somehow lighter in the stillness of the night. Caleb didn't know where this journey was leading, but in that moment, he felt the first stirrings of something powerful, something that had nothing to do with survival or duty. It was the beginning of understanding, the fragile start of trust. Maybe, Nayeli said, her voice a little stronger now. Maybe there's more than one way to fight for peace. Caleb looked at her, her words slowly sinking in. He had been fighting for peace his whole life, but had he ever really understood what it meant? I don't know what's next, Caleb said, standing up and stretching his stiff limbs. But I'll make sure you're safe for as long as I can. That's the only thing I'm sure of. Nayeli nodded, her expression softening. In her eyes, Caleb saw a flicker of something new, hope. And that, he thought, was a start. The fire flickered softly as Caleb sat on a low rock, his hands resting on his knees. Nayeli was still lying against the rock, propped up by the saddle blanket he had spread out for her. The firelight danced on her face, highlighting the thin sheen of sweat that covered her forehead. She was still weak, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, as though she had seen so much suffering in her life that the thought of more didn't faze her. For Caleb, this was all uncharted territory. He had grown up with the notion that survival was a fight. Fight to survive, fight to win, fight against the world that wanted to crush him. But helping Nayeli, this was different. He had no weapon in his hand, no force behind his actions, only the sheer will to do something right for once, even if it meant defying everything he had been taught. Caleb looked down at the small campfire between them. The crackling of the flames was the only sound for a long while. The wind in the distance a gentle hum against the still night. "Tell me more about your father," Caleb asked after a time, his voice quieter than usual, almost as if he were afraid of disturbing the peace between them. Nayeli hesitated for a moment, then looked up at him, her dark eyes tired but piercing. She had shared bits and pieces of her life with him in the last few hours, but there was a distance in her tone, a wall she had yet to break down completely. "Chief Hatani," she started slowly, as if each word took some effort. He was a leader, a protector of our people. He fought for our land, for our way of life." She paused, her gaze dropping to the ground. But he also knew when it was time to fight, and when it was time to make peace. Caleb watched her, intrigued. "Peace," he echoed. "I thought that was something you weren't interested in." She met his gaze again, a soft smile flickering on her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Many of us thought that way, but not my father. He saw the destruction war was doing to both sides. The bloodshed, the families lost, the land lost." She shook her head. "He wanted to end the fighting. He wanted to talk to the white men, to find a way for us to live together. But not everyone agreed." Caleb felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest, the weight of her words sinking in. Here he was, someone who had been raised to fear and hate the Apache, yet her father, the very leader of her people, had wanted peace. "What happened?" he asked softly, afraid to hear the answer. "War happened," Nayeli said, her voice thick with grief. "Some wanted revenge. Others wanted land. My father, he was not able to stop them. The warriors who followed him believed peace was a weakness. They wanted to keep fighting." Caleb nodded slowly, the pieces of the world he had known suddenly shifting in his mind. He'd heard stories, rumors really, about the savagery of the Apache, how they attacked, without mercy, how they were the enemy. But Nayeli's words were different. Her father wasn't a savage. He was a man who understood the cost of war, who saw that peace, no matter how hard to reach, was worth fighting for. "Your father was a good man," Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. Nayeli's eyes softened, and for the first time, Caleb saw the flicker of gratitude in them. "He was. But he's gone now," she said, her voice tinged with a deep sadness. "The peace he wanted, it never came." They were silent for a long while. The fire crackled, and Caleb's mind whirred with the realization that everything he thought he knew about this land, about the people who lived on it, was wrong. All his life he'd been told the Apaches were the enemy, but Nayeli wasn't the enemy. She wasn't some ruthless warrior. She was a daughter, a survivor, a woman who had seen the worst of life and kept going, just like him. "Why didn't you kill me when you had the chance?" Nayeli's voice broke through his thoughts again. Caleb looked at her, surprised by the question. He had been wondering the same thing himself. Why hadn't he done it? Why hadn't he just let her die there on the desert floor? It would have been the easier choice. "I couldn't," Caleb said simply, his voice steady. "I guess I couldn't do what I was told." Nayeli's lips parted, as though she didn't quite believe him. But she didn't argue. Instead, she shifted slightly on the ground, wincing at the pain in her side. Caleb moved quickly to her side, concerned. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said, her tone soft, though her eyes betrayed the pain she was trying to hide. "Just tired." Caleb nodded, watching her for a moment longer. He felt the weight of her words, of the trust she was slowly offering him, and in turn, he offered her something in return: his silence. He didn't need to explain himself further. She was starting to see that he was no enemy. As he stoked the fire and settled down beside her, Caleb realized something that he hadn't even fully acknowledged before. He wasn't alone anymore. In this desolate, unforgiving world, he had found something that resembled peace, however fragile it might be. And it had all started with a single act of mercy. The days that followed were an exhausting blur of endless travel. The desert stretched out before them like an unyielding sea, its vast emptiness pressing in on Caleb and Nayeli as they rode, constantly on the move, always looking over their shoulders. Caleb's body ached, his muscles protesting the unrelenting pace, but he pushed through the pain, determined to get Nayeli the help she needed. Nayeli's wound, though treated with makeshift bandages, was still a constant threat. The blood loss, combined with the fever that came and went, made her weak. Caleb had to remind her to drink water, to eat, though she didn't have the strength to argue. Every night, he watched over her, making sure the fire stayed lit and that she was safe, though he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was never far behind. But what worried him the most was how much they were both relying on each other. There were times when he caught himself glancing at her, wondering how things had come to this. He was no healer, and she was no ally. She was the daughter of a leader who had tried to negotiate peace, someone from a world that was supposed to be his enemy. And yet, here they were, traveling together, surviving together. Caleb didn't know how to reconcile the man he had been with the one he was becoming. One evening, as they stopped to rest in a small ravine, Caleb could see the strain in Nayeli's eyes. She was trying to hide it, but there was a tension in her that hadn't been there before. The desert had a way of stripping people of their pride, of making them face the raw truth of themselves. "I'm slowing you down," she said suddenly, her voice low but firm. She was sitting on a rock, wiping the sweat from her brow. the evening sun casting long shadows across her face. Caleb paused in what he was doing, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "You're carrying me. You're feeding me. You're risking everything for someone like me," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I should be the one helping you, not the other way around." Caleb walked over to her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. He knelt in front of her, looking her squarely in the eyes. "I'm not doing this because I have to," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm doing it because I choose to, because I see you, not as some enemy, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. And you've been helping me in ways you don't even realize." She looked at him, the faintest trace of surprise flickering across her face. "You're not like the others," she murmured, almost to herself. Caleb's lips curled into a faint, tired smile. "I hope not." There was a long pause between them. Caleb knew they were both tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending that they weren't afraid. But as he sat there beside her, the weight of his choices heavy in his chest, he realized something that caught him off guard. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was trying to protect something inside himself. The same thing he had been running from for years. The idea that there was more to this world than just surviving. There had to be something more. Just then, Caleb heard the sound of hooves in the distance, and his heart skipped a beat. His instincts immediately kicked in. The feeling of being hunted, always just one step behind, returned in an instant. He stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle strapped to his back. Nayeli too stood, her eyes scanning the horizon with that same sharp awareness that he had begun to recognize. She too was used to danger. "They're close," she said softly. "You need to hide. They won't take kindly to me." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. "We can't outrun them. We have to fight." But she shook her head, her expression hardening with the experience of someone who had seen too much violence. "Not like this. We'll only make it worse. If they find us together." He didn't need her to finish. He understood. They had no choice. They couldn't afford to be discovered. Not now, not after everything they had been through, not with her life hanging in the balance. "We run," Caleb said firmly. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." He turned, grabbing the reins of Dusty and leading the way through the narrow passage, his heart racing. He could feel the sweat running down his back, the pressure building in his chest. The knowledge that they were running from someone, maybe from everyone, was suffocating. But he couldn't back down now. Not when she needed him. Not when they both needed each other. As they made their way through the ravine, Caleb's mind raced. Who were they? What did they want? Could it be someone from the ranch? Or worse, a bounty hunter on their trail? Every possible scenario ran through his mind, but none of them made sense. He couldn't afford to think too long about it. After what seemed like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, and Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had gotten away, for now. But the weight of their situation was heavy, and Caleb could feel the tension in his muscles. They found a small crevice to hide in, the stone walls close enough to make them feel safe, but not enough to protect them from the dangers that lay ahead. Caleb leaned against the wall, sweat dripping from his brow as he tried to calm his breathing. Nayeli sat down beside him, her face pale but composed. She didn't speak, but Caleb could feel her presence beside him. In that silence, in that moment, they were both bound by the same reality. They were not just surviving, they were living. And that, Caleb realized, was enough for now. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them like a heavy blanket, suffocating any words that might have been said. Caleb had always prided himself on being able to handle pressure. He was a rancher, a survivor, a man who knew how to get by. But now, as he sat on the cold, jagged rocks beside Nayeli, he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had saved her life. He had made the choice to take her from the desert, to risk everything for someone he was supposed to hate. Yet, he was no closer to understanding why, no closer to figuring out how he could reconcile the man he had been with the one he was becoming. Nayeli had barely spoken since their narrow escape. She sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the ground. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, but there was something in her eyes, something like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Caleb knew she was angry, but there was something else there too, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. They had made it through the night. Barely. But now they were alone in a world where both their pasts would never let them go. Every movement, every glance was a reminder of the danger they were in. And yet, despite the peril, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile truce between them was something worth fighting for. I should have left you there. Nayeli's voice broke the silence, and the sharpness of her words stung like a slap. Caleb flinched, his eyes flickering to her. What do you mean? She turned to him then, her eyes fierce, though the exhaustion was evident in her every movement. You should have left me to die. If you'd just let me go, none of this would be happening. You wouldn't be risking your life for someone like me. I'm just another Apache, a reminder of everything you've been taught to hate. Her words hit Caleb like a gut punch. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know how to explain it to her. He didn't know how to tell her that the world he'd been raised in, the one that saw her as nothing more than a savage, was fading, piece by piece, right in front of him. How could he tell her that everything he thought he knew about honor, about loyalty, about what was right, was being shattered by a single choice? You're wrong, Caleb said finally, his voice low but firm. I don't see you that way. I don't see you as the enemy. I see you as someone who's been forced into a fight you never asked for. Nayeli shook her head bitterly, a laugh that was half pain, half disbelief escaping her lips. You think I'm some helpless victim? She spat. You think that's what this is about? I have killed Caleb. I've fought beside my people, fought for my survival. I'm not some innocent who didn't ask for it. Caleb's heart clenched. He had never seen her like this. The fierce pride in her voice, the anger that matched his own, was enough to make him question everything. the way she had been taught to fight, to kill, to survive. It wasn't that different from the way he had been raised. But there was something about her now, something raw, something human, that made him want to reach out, to fix what had been broken. "I'm not saying you're innocent," Caleb replied, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I'm saying you're more than that. You're more than the hatred you've been taught. You're more than a warrior or a fighter. You're you. And you don't deserve to die out here, alone, because of things you didn't choose." For a long moment, Nayeli didn't speak. Her face was hard, but Caleb could see something shifting behind her eyes. He didn't know if it was forgiveness or something else. But in that silence, Caleb realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't trying to save her. He was saving himself. He had spent so many years running from his own demons, his past, his guilt, his fear of being alone, that he hadn't realized he was already looking for a way out, a way to make peace with himself. And maybe, just maybe, saving Nayeli was the only way he knew how to start. "Why didn't you kill me when you had the chance?" Nayeli asked again, her voice quieter this time, more vulnerable than before. Caleb didn't look away. Instead, he leaned closer to her, his gaze softening. "Because you deserve more than that. I can't change what's been done to you, to your people, but I can change what's going to happen next." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand. "What's going to happen next?" she asked softly. Caleb took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for her. He could feel the weight of the world lifting just a little as he finally found the words he needed to say. "We survive," he said simply, the decision clear in his mind now. "We survive together." The days dragged on as Caleb and Nayeli pushed through the desert, the once simple path now feeling like an endless trial. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, pressing in on them, suffocating. Their supplies were dwindling, and each morning seemed harder than the last. They had barely any water left, and the weight of their constant movement was starting to take its toll. Caleb's thoughts were clouded with doubts. Every choice he made felt wrong. He couldn't protect Nayeli from the world, and every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into danger. They were both being hunted, not just by the men who had followed them, but by the ghosts of their pasts, the weight of their histories bearing down on them. He could see the toll it was taking on Nayeli, too. She had become quieter, more withdrawn. Her wound was healing, but the toll of the desert, the fear of being discovered, the weight of the betrayal she had felt when Caleb had saved her, all of it was chipping away at her resolve. Her fiery spirit was dimming. "Caleb," Nayeli spoke in the dead of night, her voice barely above a whisper. She was sitting a few feet away from the fire, staring into the darkness. "What happens if they find us? What if we don't make it out of here?" Her question hit Caleb harder than he expected. He had no answer. He had never felt more uncertain, more unsure of anything in his life. There was no clear path forward, no promise of safety. The only thing he could do was move forward, hoping that somehow, against all odds, they would survive. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of his own fear. He stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down beside her. "I'm trying, Nayeli. I'm trying to make it right. I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but I won't leave you." Her eyes were distant, lost in some private thought. She looked at him, but for a moment, it felt like she wasn't really seeing him at all. She was trapped in the shadows of her own thoughts, haunted by everything that had led her here. "You think this is going to end well?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with a bitterness that hurt Caleb to hear. "You think we can outrun the past? You think we can outrun what I am?" Caleb's heart clenched as he reached out, taking her hand in his. He didn't know how to reassure her, didn't know how to tell her that everything would be okay. He couldn't promise her that. What he could promise was that he wouldn't stop fighting. For her. For himself. "I don't know," he said honestly, his voice raw. "I don't know if we can outrun anything, but we can't give up. Not yet." But deep inside, Caleb was beginning to question whether they could outrun the forces that were closing in on them. Not just the men chasing them, but the weight of their own histories, their own choices. Could they really move past the bloodshed, the hate, the betrayal? Or was that burden something they would carry forever? The next morning, as they packed up camp, Caleb heard the sound of hooves in the distance. His heart leapt into his throat, the familiar tension of danger washing over him once again. The fear was immediate, instinctual, as if his body had learned to recognize the sound of pursuit. "We need to move," Caleb said urgently, his voice sharp. "Now!" Nayeli nodded, her face grim. She didn't need him to say anything more. She was already on her feet, moving quickly, her body instinctively preparing for the fight ahead. Caleb didn't wait. He grabbed Dusty's reins and led the horse forward, his pulse pounding in his ears. Nayeli was close behind him, her steps steady despite the exhaustion. They had been running for days now, and Caleb could feel the weight of it, on his body, in his soul. The pressure was suffocating, but there was no choice but to keep moving. As they turned to leave the camp, Caleb could hear the riders closing in, their pursuit relentless. He wasn't sure how much longer they could outrun them, but the world around them had become a battleground, and Caleb had never felt more like a pawn in a war he didn't understand. "I'm sorry," Nayeli said suddenly, her voice tight, her words sharp. "I'm sorry for everything, for bringing you into this." Caleb stopped and turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You didn't bring me into anything, Nayeli. I made my choice." Her eyes flickered with something like regret, but there was also a flicker of determination. "We've been running for too long," she said, her voice firm now. "It's time to stop." And just like that, the realization hit Caleb. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't keep hiding. The fight had come to them, whether they wanted it or not. With a deep breath, Caleb turned toward the oncoming riders. His hand instinctively went to his rifle. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for something more, for the chance to make a difference, to change something, anything, in a world that had taught him there was only one way forward. It was time to face the truth. The only thing that could stop the chaos was him, and he wasn't going to back down. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert as Caleb and Nayeli braced themselves for the approaching riders. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, the steady rhythm of fear and adrenaline drowning out everything else. The sound of hooves was getting louder, closer. He knew they were outnumbered, but there was no turning back now. "Get ready," Caleb whispered to Nayeli, his voice calm but filled with a tension that she could feel in every part of her. His fingers brushed against the cold, worn stock of his rifle. His mind raced, running through every possible scenario. There was no escape this time. Nayeli stood beside him, her body rigid, her face set in a mask of determination. She was no stranger to battle, to the sound of approaching danger. She had seen more bloodshed than Caleb could even imagine. And yet, there was something different in the air now. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if the moment they were about to face would change everything. The riders emerged from the horizon, their figures casting long silhouettes against the fiery sky. At the front of the group was a man Caleb recognized, Rogan. His broad frame was unmistakable, the dark, cold look in his eyes sending a chill down Caleb's spine. Rogan was a traitor, a man who had betrayed his own people for the promise of power, and now he was hunting them. "We need to take them out before they get too close," Caleb said, his voice low. He turned to Nayeli, his eyes locking with hers. "We fight, or we die." Nayeli nodded, her jaw tightening. "I've fought before. We fight." They moved quickly, taking their positions behind the rocks, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The desert around them was still, but Caleb could feel the tension in the air. Every muscle in his body was on edge. He could almost taste the danger that was approaching. The riders slowed as they reached the edge of the ravine. Caleb knew they would be able to see them soon if they didn't act. His pulse quickened. There was no room for hesitation. "On my signal," Caleb whispered. Nayeli shifted slightly, her hand resting on the hilt of a knife she had strapped to her side. Her eyes flickered to Caleb for a moment, before turning back to the riders. She was ready. Caleb didn't wait long. With a swift motion, he stood up, firing a shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the desert, followed by the crackle of rocks as he and Nayeli burst into motion. The riders reacted immediately. Rogan's men scrambled to draw their weapons, but Caleb and Nayeli were faster. Caleb fired another shot, this time striking the lead rider in the leg, causing him to fall from his horse with a scream. The chaos erupted in an instant. Hooves pounding the earth, men shouting, the crack of gunfire filling the air. Nayeli moved like a shadow, her knife flashing as she took down one of Rogan's men. Caleb's rifle was steady in his hands, each shot precise as he covered her. The two of them fought as one, their movements synchronized, their hearts beating as one in the face of danger. For the first time since they had met, Caleb didn't feel like he was alone. With Nayeli beside him, He wasn't just a survivor. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a fight for something real, something that mattered. But the battle wasn't over yet. Rogan, though, had retreated, and Caleb could see him now, riding back to regroup with his remaining men. His eyes burned with fury, and Caleb knew they couldn't afford to let him escape. Nayeli saw it too. "We finish this now," she said through gritted teeth. There was a fire in her eyes, a fire Caleb hadn't seen before, and it made him feel something powerful stir inside him. The chase was on. Caleb and Nayeli mounted their horses, charging after Rogan and his men. The dust kicked up beneath them, the sound of hooves pounding the earth like thunder. Caleb's heart raced, his focus entirely on the figure of Rogan ahead. They pushed harder, faster. Caleb's pulse beat in his ears, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Nayeli was close behind him, her gaze locked on their target. Together, they were unstoppable. As they neared Rogan's group, Caleb raised his rifle once again, taking careful aim. One shot rang out. Rogan's horse reared, throwing him to the ground with a sickening thud. The remaining men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. That was all Caleb and Nayeli needed. In a matter of moments, they had disarmed and subdued the rest of Rogan's men. The fight was over. Caleb rode up to Rogan, who was groaning on the ground, trying to crawl away. Caleb dismounted, his boots hitting the sand with a sharp thud. He approached Rogan, who was now glaring up at him with hatred. "You've lost," Caleb said, his voice cold, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Rogan spat on the ground, his chest heaving in frustration. "You think you've won, cowboy? You think you've made a difference?" Caleb stared down at him, his face hard. "I don't need to win. I just need to make sure you don't destroy what's left of this world." As Caleb turned to mount his horse, he saw Nayeli standing beside him, her expression resolute. She had fought for something greater than just survival. She had fought for peace, for a chance at something different. Together, they had made a stand, and for the first time in his life, Caleb knew that they weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for a future. The dust settled around them like a heavy fog as Caleb and Nayeli stood amidst the chaos of the battle, their enemies defeated, but their hearts far from calm. The roar of gunfire had subsided, but the silence that followed was deafening. Caleb's hands were still shaking, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he surveyed the battlefield. The sun was now setting, casting a red glow over the scene, as though the world itself was bleeding. Rogan's men lay scattered on the ground, groaning in pain or lying still, their weapons discarded in the dirt. Caleb's pulse was still racing, but the battle had left him with something more than just fear. He felt a strange sense of relief. He had done what he needed to do to protect Nayeli. He had made a stand, and for the first time he wasn't afraid of the consequences. But there was something deeper inside him, something stirring in his chest. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. And it wasn't just Rogan and his men Caleb needed to worry about anymore. "We need to move," Caleb said, his voice low but urgent. He wasn't sure how much time they had before more enemies arrived. He couldn't afford to linger, not with Nayeli's life still in danger. Nayeli nodded, her face grim, though there was a quiet strength in her eyes that Caleb hadn't seen before. She was no longer just the Apache woman he had found in the desert. She had become someone he could trust, someone who stood beside him in the fight. Together, they began to collect the fallen weapons and prepare their horses. Caleb felt a fierce, burning determination. He had made a choice and he was going to stick with it. There was no going back. "Where do we go now?" Nayeli asked, her voice steady despite the fear that still lingered in the air. "We go north," Caleb replied without hesitation. "There's a settlement up in the hills, Dead Lantern. We'll find shelter there." Nayeli didn't question him. She had learned to trust him, just as he had started to trust her. They moved quickly, preparing for the long ride ahead. Caleb's heart was still pounding in his chest, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something deeper, something that pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain. It was the pull of a future that was still uncertain, a future that depended on both of them surviving. And for the first time in his life, Caleb realized that this fight wasn't just about survival. It was about change, changing the course of their lives, changing what he had been taught, and most importantly, changing the future they would share. The journey north wasn't easy. The path was rocky and treacherous, but they pressed on, the weight of the past beginning to lift with every mile they covered. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and Caleb pulled his coat tighter around him, glancing over at Nayeli, who was riding beside him. "How's the wound?" he asked quietly. "Better," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I'll survive." Caleb smiled, though it was more of a tired grimace than anything else. "You're tough. I didn't think I'd be able to save you back there." She gave him a faint smile, her eyes flickering with something like amusement. "You're not as useless as you look, Caleb Booker." He chuckled softly, grateful for the small moments of levity amidst the tension. As they rode in silence, Caleb realized that despite everything that had happened, despite the violence, the betrayal, the fear, he was starting to feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. Hope. And it wasn't just for himself. It was for Nayeli, for them both, and for the future they were building together, step by step. "We'll get through this," Caleb said, his voice steady. "We'll make it to Dead Lantern, and then we'll figure out what's next." Nayeli's gaze softened as she looked at him. "I believe you." For a moment, Caleb felt something shift between them, a bond forged in the heat of battle, but now tempered by the quiet understanding of two people who had faced death together. And somehow, that bond felt stronger than any of the enemies they had fought, stronger than the world that had tried to tear them apart. They rode on through the night, their journey far from over, but for the first time, Caleb felt like they were heading in the right direction. By the time they reached Dead Lantern, the night had deepened, and the stars shone like cold diamonds in the sky. The town was small, a patch of civilization nestled in the hills, surrounded by rugged terrain and wild country. It was a place for outlaws, drifters, and those who had nowhere else to go. Caleb had been here a few times before, but never with the weight of what he was carrying now, the lives of both him and Nayeli hanging in the balance. As they rode into town, the building seemed lifeless, silent, as if they, too, were holding their breath. The saloon was the first to show signs of life, lights flickering through the cracks in the weathered wood, the sound of voices filtering through the door. It was a welcome sight, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay close," Caleb muttered to Nayeli as they dismounted. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, and he knew and was aware of the danger they still faced. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was still full of uncertainty. Nayeli nodded, her face tight with resolve. She had changed since they had first met, her fierce independence now tempered with a kind of quiet strength. She had learned to trust him, but he knew that trust was fragile, and it would take time to rebuild the pieces of themselves they had both lost along the way. They approached the saloon slowly, Caleb's hand never far from the pistol at his side. He didn't know what they would find inside, but the odds of finding help here were better than anywhere else. The question was, would they find the help they needed, or just another set of dangers to face? As they entered the saloon, the noise of the room hit them instantly. It was a mix of laughter, low conversation, and the clinking of glasses. A handful of men were gathered around the bar, their faces worn by years of hardship, their eyes dull but watchful. A few patrons glanced up as Caleb and Nayeli walked in, but quickly turned their attention back to their drinks. Behind the bar stood the man Caleb had been hoping to find, Dr. Marlowe. The town's doctor was a rough man, older than most, with a graying beard and sharp eyes. He was well known in these parts for his skills with a needle and thread, but also for his less-than-legal ways of keeping the town's residents alive. Caleb stepped up to the bar, nodding at Dr. Marlowe. "Need your help, Doc." Marlowe studied him for a moment, his eyes flickering to Nayeli. "I see you brought your Apache friend with you." His voice was gruff, but not unfriendly. "She hurt?" "Bad," Caleb said shortly, glancing over his shoulder at Nayeli, who stood a few steps behind him, her face still drawn from the pain and exhaustion. "She needs treatment now." The doctor nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come back to the office. Let's see what we're working with." Caleb led the way, with Nayeli following closely behind. The small back room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and old wood. A cot was pushed up against one wall, and various medical tools were scattered across a table, their purpose clear even without explanation. Dr. Marlowe gestured to the cot. "Lay her down." Nayeli hesitated, but only for a moment, before she allowed Caleb to help her to the cot. Her eyes were closed as she sank into it, her face pale and strained. Dr. Marlowe went to work immediately, unwrapping the makeshift bandages that had been holding her together. Caleb watched in silence as the doctor examined the wound, his hands swift and efficient. There was a sense of quiet professionalism in the way the doctor moved, and for a moment, Caleb allowed himself to breathe again. He couldn't afford to lose her. Not now. "What happened to her?" Marlowe asked without looking up, his voice cool but curious. Caleb hesitated, She was attacked by her own people. He didn't know why he answered like that, why the words came so easily. But it was the truth, and in this moment, the weight of it felt real, like something they couldn't ignore anymore. Dr. Marlowe raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He just continued his work, cleaning the wound carefully. "You sure you want to be in town with her? The way things are going, you might want to keep moving. People don't take kindly to Apaches around here." Caleb looked at him, the anger rising in his chest. "She's not just some Apache. She's a person. She's a human being." Marlowe paused, then glanced up at Caleb. "I didn't say she wasn't. But you've got to understand. Out here, people see her as the enemy. They see you too, for that matter." Caleb clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there, his heart beating a little faster with the realization that the world he had left behind was never far away. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to tear things apart. As Marlowe finished cleaning the wound and wrapping it with fresh bandages, he stepped back. "She'll be fine for now, but she needs rest, and she'll need some proper care in the next few days. If she's going to make it, you'll have to keep her out of the heat and give her time to heal." Caleb nodded, relief flooding through him. She was going to be okay. For now. Nayeli stirred as Caleb sat beside her. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a tired but grateful look. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft. Caleb gave her a small, tired smile. "We're not done yet, but you're safe here. For now." She nodded, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion she had been fighting for days. As Caleb watched her drift into sleep, he felt the weight of the world lighten just a little. But he knew the peace wouldn't last long. There would be more battles to fight, more roads to walk. But for the first time, Caleb didn't feel like he was walking alone. The morning after they arrived at Dead Lantern, the town was quiet, eerily so. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few drifters and the odd townsperson passing by. The night had been long, filled with whispers and silent fears. But now, with the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, Caleb felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for days. It was as if the weight of the decision he had made had settled into his bones, and despite the risks, despite the danger that still loomed, he knew they had to keep moving forward. Nayeli had rested most of the night, but when she woke, the first thing she did was sit up, her eyes scanning the room with that sharp alertness that Caleb had come to recognize. She was ready to face whatever came next, and Caleb admired her for it. She wasn't afraid to face the truth, even when the truth was an uncertain future, surrounded by enemies both old and new. Caleb stood at the window, looking out over the town. The sun was just beginning to warm the earth, and the air felt heavy with the scent of dry dust. There was still a long road ahead of them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were at the edge of something larger than just survival, something that would require all their strength, all their resolve. He turned to look at Nayeli, who was pulling on her boots with slow, deliberate movements. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what they were about to face. Nayeli glanced up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, Caleb saw the uncertainty in her eyes, but it was fleeting, replaced quickly by something else, something stronger. "I don't know," she admitted, standing up. "But I've come this far. There's no turning back." Caleb felt a knot form in his stomach. This was it, the moment of truth. He had always known that one day they would have to confront the world together, not as enemies, but as something more, something different. And now, as soon as he looked at her, he knew that she was right. There was no turning back. They had made it this far together, and now they would have to face the future, whatever it held. As they prepared to leave the small, dimly lit room, Caleb felt a strange, quiet determination settle over him. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone. When they stepped outside, the town was still asleep, and the streets stretched out before them, empty and silent. Caleb adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder and looked at Nayeli. She was walking beside him now, not behind him. She wasn't just a survivor. She was his partner. And for the first time, Caleb allowed himself to believe that together they could make it through this. They could carve out a new life. They walked through the streets with heads held high, moving toward a future they could shape together. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still enemies out there, still people who wouldn't understand their bond, who would see them as enemies no matter what. But Caleb didn't care. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, for a world where he and Nayeli and people like them could live side by side. A world where peace, no matter how fragile, was possible. They reached the edge of the town, and Caleb paused, glancing over at Nayeli. Her eyes were bright, her expression set, and in that moment, Caleb saw everything he needed to see. She wasn't just an Apache woman. She was a fighter. She was his fighter. "We don't have to do this alone," Caleb said, his voice firm. Nayeli gave him a small smile, and though it didn't reach her eyes entirely, it was enough to let him know that they were in this together. For the first time, Caleb allowed himself to feel the possibility of hope. They were going to fight for that future, together. And with that, they turned and began walking down the long road ahead, the promise of something more lingering in the air. The seasons shifted quietly, one after another, as Caleb and Nayeli continued to shape their world. The quiet hum of daily life, once a distant dream, had become their reality. The small cabin they had built together stood as a testament to their resilience. It was more than just four walls and a roof. It was their sanctuary, a place where the past couldn't follow them. It was their future, slowly taking root in the soil they had cultivated with their hands, their love, and their determination. The land they had claimed as their own had become a reflection of who they were now. Once barren, it was now alive with the colors of their crops, vibrant fields of wheat, beans, and corn swaying in the breeze. A small orchard of fruit trees bloomed nearby, its branches heavy with peaches and apples in the summer. The earth, once harsh and unforgiving, had become fertile, not just with crops, but with new beginnings. The laughter of their children echoed in the distance. Their two boys, Daniel and Sam, played by the stream that ran through their lawn, their voices high and free. They had learned to swim in that same stream, and as they splashed in the cool water, Caleb couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was a world so different from the one Caleb had been raised in, and it was all the more precious because of it. Nayeli often joined the boys by the water, her presence a calming force that seemed to anchor the whole family. Watching her now, Caleb couldn't believe how far they had come. The fierce, independent Apache woman he had first met in the desert had transformed into the heart of their home. There was no more fear in her eyes, only the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting to be nurtured in a world that had never allowed it to flourish. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, Caleb sat on the porch, watching Nayeli with their children. She had been gathering firewood, the last chore of the day, but now she stood still, looking out over the land. Her gaze was distant, thoughtful. Caleb stood and walked over to her, his boots soft on the dirt. He stood beside her, following her gaze across the fields, but his attention was on her. There was something different in her posture tonight, something that told him she was deep in thought, perhaps even a little restless. "Penny for your thoughts?" Caleb asked, his voice soft but inviting. Nayeli turned her head slightly, giving him a small, knowing smile. "I was just thinking about the past," she said quietly, "about everything we've been through, and about everything we still have." Caleb nodded, the weight of her words settling between them. "I've been thinking about that too," he said after a beat. "About how far we've come, how far we've managed to go, even when the odds were against us." She met his gaze now, and the love in her eyes was as deep as the land they had claimed together. "You saved me, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You showed me a future I never thought was possible." "And you saved me," he said, with a soft chuckle, but it was no joke. He spoke the truth. "I would have never thought there was a world beyond the ranch, beyond the hate. You opened my eyes to a different way of living." They stood in silence for a moment, their hands finding each other, their fingers interlacing without a second thought. Caleb's thumb stroked the back of Nayeli's hand, a gesture that spoke volumes without a word needing to be said. Their connection was deep, roots planted together in the same soil, surviving, thriving, and now blooming with the promise of peace. "We're lucky," Caleb said after a while, his voice soft. "Not everyone gets a second chance like we did." Nayeli nodded, her eyes glimmering in the fading light. "Yes, and we've made the most of it." The quiet of the evening settled over them, and for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like there was nothing standing in their way. Not the world that had tried to tear them apart, not the enemies that had once stalked them, and not even the ghosts of their past. The future was theirs to build, together. As they walked back to the cabin, their children trailing behind them, Caleb felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He knew there were still challenges ahead, still threats from the past that might one day rise again. But for now, they had created something that mattered. They had created a place for themselves, a home, a family, and a love that had been tested and found unbreakable. And as they sat together around the fire that night, the warmth of the flames reflecting in their eyes, Caleb knew that this was just the beginning. They had made it through the worst of it, and now they were free to live the life they had always deserved. The future, whatever it held, was theirs, together. As Caleb and Nayeli's story comes to a close, we are reminded that love and forgiveness can transform even the darkest of pasts. Their journey shows us the power of second chances, hope, and the bonds that unite us all, no matter our differences. If this heartfelt story touched your heart, we'd be grateful if you'd give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know how this story resonated with you and where you're watching from. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Your support means everything